Welcome to the RSP cast. I'm Matt Waldman, and joining me today is NFL.com researcher Chad Reuter. Chad, it's always a pleasure. A good friend too. Someone who I feel like we have our own podcast that just doesn't have an audience.
Yeah, and let's keep it that way, shall
Yeah,
we?
I think that's a
Yeah.
good idea. That's for sure. But I've always valued the work that Chad's done for many years, and when I was just getting started with this, he was very gracious to provide feedback to me early on when I was really craving it at a level from someone who had done the work like he had, and it was always very encouraging. He's always been very encouraging to a lot of people and in this industry, and I think that anyone you would talk to who knows anything about like draft analysis in the media, I think if I met someone who had a bad word to say about Chad, I think there would probably, even if it were just me, I think there'd probably be about five other people that would probably shout that person down. Kudos to you on that front.
I appreciate that, and I can say much of the same about you. And honestly, yeah, there's probably some people who don't have some great things, but you know what? That's life.
That's
So
that's life.
I'm blessed to be able to do this stuff and work with people like you, get to know people like you, and many others. And yeah, I'm thrilled. I'm also thrilled that we're almost at the time of this event, and we can
Yeah,
finally get to it and move past it and get working on next year's RSP. Well,
yeah,
I guess you can't really do that, but for me, I can get started on the next class
yeah,
within like a week after this one's over. So,
yeah.
you know, got my 2025 draft folder all set up now, all ready to go. I can ship over about 500 guys that could have been in this draft that are back for
Yeah.
next year. So it's that's gonna be interesting.
No, it'll be good, and I think that one of the things that's going to be, I've just kind of noted that we've kind of already been through the medicine show tent and the freak show and all the different stuff that happens outside the circus. Now we're about to enter the circus tent,
Yeah,
so that's kind of where
yeah.
we're at. And so with that in mind, I thought,
Yep.
yep. So we'll probably, today we're going to talk a little bit about some of your favorite prospects, some of your prospects that you feel like that their draft capital may not match the level of work or fit that they're likely to find themselves in. But before we do that, I thought it would be fun, especially as someone such as yourself who does a lot, has spent a lot of years doing mock drafts. Talk but also scouting players at the level you do. Let's talk a little bit about evaluation and valuation because I think that I had a scout and an analytics person talk with me a couple weeks ago and just kind of complain about the state of affairs in the media sometimes about about evaluation and valuation. So first, I mean, just from a scouting perspective, how would you explain the difference between evaluation and valuation?
Well, the way I look at it, you need to do the evaluation first. You have to, as many people know, maybe some don't. There's an initial evaluation of players by a bunch of regional scouts, and teams get that information in the spring. And then a team's own scouts and their general managers and et cetera then do their own evaluation and 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 throughout the course of the season. And you have to do that part first. And once you've identified the things that you like about players and the way that they could fit in your system, then you have to think about what you're willing to give up to get them. And the valuation of when his value, when you the value you see in him as being an acquisition, really. Um, and I think you need to do the eval first, and then you get to the valuation, and both are very important. I mean, I think um, the evaluation at some level is difficult enough. But then valuation, a lot of people focus on that, but it is important. I mean, I think, for example, let's just say you're talking about a baseball card or something like that, right? And you could say, I've got this awesome Willie Mays, and it is in good condition, and all of that, and then you go to auction and nobody's willing to give you more than $5 for it, right?
Yeah.
Oh, but I look it up in the book and it's worth X amount of dollars. Like, no, it's worth what somebody's willing to pay for it. And it's also the same in a sense with prospects, where you can evaluate a guy, both first play on the field, character off, injuries off, all this other things that you're doing as part of the evaluation. And then, but then you have to understand, what his value is. So you evaluate a player, and you think, okay, this guy, I can see him, starting as a contributor, maybe a DPR as an edge rusher, to start, and then growing into something more. And then you have to decide where to get him. Well, a lot of people want to jump to, well, that guy's worth a fourth-round pick. Well, yes and no. You have to look at the other players available in the draft. You have to look at how he fits in your system. There's a lot of factors to consider. So you do the eval, you see what you've seen in the player, what you think that role will be for a player, what he can give you. And then you look at the draft as a whole. You look at past prospects as similar players and where they've gone, and just to think about, and then relative to other players, where there may be spots where you can get a certain guy a little bit later because there's a lot of that sort of player in this draft. So I think they're both valuable, and you have to really be able to do both to be successful.
And depth chart, I would think, matters as well, doesn't it? In terms of like what your current team situation is, goes into that valuation, right? Like if you say have a player who has 1 or 2 years left, I mean, would that be another area that you put into it, or no?
Yeah, I think I yes, when you're talking about when to make that pick, but I think I think the team's makeup is not potentially when it's time. So when it's time to make that pick, or when you're really setting up your board, then that comes into play. But when you're just focusing on the player himself,
Right.
then I think you do that. And then what happened, a lot of people want to say, oh, like these teams rank these players 1 to 250, and then whoever's on, happens to be up next on the board is the one they're going to take, right? And
Right.
that's not at all how it goes. And nor should you say that, because once you get outside the top 20 picks, the top 50, then the top 80, then the top 150, then the valuation really is pretty similar. And then you have to think about, okay, depth chart, future free agency, not just next year's free agents, but the year after, a lot of factors like that. And I think that's where that comes into play.
Okay, good. Because that's the thing that I think probably maybe part of that was what the analytics professional with some NFL experience was kind of noting when he said, look, I just gave up trying to explain the difference between evaluation and valuation to some of the numbers crowd in the media analyst community. He said, he felt like it was just too much, there was too much tunnel vision. And it was tunnel vision
Yeah.
on metric concepts that he said don't work in a chaotic football world. So he attributes to the belief that, like, say, for instance, the expected value, that the value data of EV data is complete and a valid NFL validation check. So he's like, this is a limited perspective. And he says it's based on the idea that if the numbers can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Kind of the idea of people who are like, momentum doesn't exist, And so he's
Yeah.
like, ultimately, these analysts, he said, he feels like lack perspective, and it can hurt or limit their football analysis on multiple levels. I mean, what do you think of his viewpoint when he
Well,
talks about it like that?
I don't even, it's not that I don't disagree with him, but I think that opinion also kind of shows his own limitations on what he's willing to, right? I mean,
Right,
I think you have to work in the middle of both worlds, where
yeah,
you're looking at your evaluation of what you see on the field. Then you're looking at these metrics. How do the metrics match up with what you see?
right,
And if you don't see something that's in the metrics, you got to determine why that is. And it could be an issue with the metric, it could be an issue with your evaluation. And then this is why you have multiple people on each team looking at players, so
right,
that they can say, look, I see this, I see. And the other thing is that metrics, look, I'm an econ guy, I'm a math guy. Uh, but there are limitations in terms of projection based on metrics, especially things like game grades that are focused on how a guy completed his assignments in college, as opposed to his ability to grow as a player. And even more metrics based on what he may have done on the field. It's a different world when you're a 22-year-old playing against 19-year-olds versus a 23-year-old playing against 30-year-olds. When you
Right.
come to the NFL, it's a different world. And obviously, past performance is our best indicator of future performance, but there's still a lot of room for error and so I think there's room for both. I think you need both in terms of to do a full truly getting ready for the draft. And yeah, it is um, it's a balancing act. It
Yeah.
really is. And I think another thing is you'll hear somebody say, "Well, I'd rather go by my gut than what the metrics tell me." But in reality, all your gut is doing the math that is putting a percentage likelihood that a player will succeed based on past prospects that are similar,
Yep.
that sort of thing, and from particular schools and particular positions, um,
It's like a
and
form of imprinting. It's like a form of
yeah,
psychological imprinting, and
yeah,
your 10,000 hours. Now, it may have been devoted to watching running backs and Woody Woodpecker, but
right,
as a fan,
right,
and somehow you were imprinted on seeing that cat on the cartoons move a certain way, and now you saw a player do it, and you didn't
yeah,
realize it. I'm being an ass, but
yeah,
there's that can be as much about of imprinting as anything else.
yeah, yeah, and I think. And that's always been the way in the NFL, right? 20 years ago, when I started talking with NFL teams about different sorts of data, they would say things like I do it on my gut, and I would have the discussion with them. I'd say, look, your gut, all that is your experience coming to the fore, and your experience is, in reality, it's a mathematical construct in your brain of what you think works and doesn't based on your experience. And then I say, the nice thing about data, if you look on a league wide basis, you're learning from everybody's experience.
It's wisdom of the
And
crowds. Yeah.
right, exactly. And you're taking in not just what you've seen, but what has everybody seen. And so I think, both are metrics, and there are things that are more difficult. I agree that there are things that are more difficult to get into metrics, physicality being one.
Yeah.
There are certain PFF has a beaten by defender uh, metric for edge rushers, or for tackles beaten by defender, but that doesn't get into whether it was hands, whether it was power, it was long. I mean, so you have to be able to evaluate based on the tool set that an edge rusher might have, or the flexibility that a offensive tackle shows, things like that are not metrics based. Although some people say you can get that through different, they're measuring lots of things now, so you can kind of get there. But um, I I think both are work together to give you the best evaluation possible.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And it's a it is. It's just we're still growing in this area. And it's probably never going to stop growing. So it's hard
Yeah.
to go that goes. But so what about this? One of the other things that I think he mentioned is he was kind of playfully ranting to me about this one morning was the idea that there's a real public emphasis on how well one team out evaluates another team, and he felt like this was a misnomer, and that we should really be judging how well a team identifies prospects to create a surplus of talent versus the average team. So, where do you stand on that idea?
Um. Well, first of all, I think we have to judge it based on who these teams actually pick, which is different than their actual evaluation skills, right? They may have other players evaluated more highly than the guys they end up getting.
Okay.
Um, so I think that's one thing to consider. Like, we only get a part of the story. We don't have every team's draft board. If we had every team's draft board and we could look at how they graded everybody, then it would be a little easier to do that analysis. But we can only go off who they pick, which is a subset, obviously. Um, so I think that's part of it. And I think the reason why people get so into, you know, really looking at the evaluation piece is that all they see on their TV on Sunday is if their team won or lost,
Yep.
and how the players that were selected by their team are performing. And in that very small sample size, if they see player X, this is the perfect Jalen Reagor, Justin Jefferson example. Eagles fans see Jalen Reagor not doing very much, and they see Justin Jefferson setting records in Minnesota. And they say, how could you possibly pick Jalen Reagor over Justin Jefferson? Right? There's no context, there's no nuance. It's just, I see this guy doing this, I see this guy doing this, and that's what they see. And frankly, this is a result based business, and it's not unfair to ask that question if at the time of the draft you had those two prospects and you were comparing them.
Yeah.
What I don't get into is a guy saying, "Oh, this guy that went in the third round should have been picked over this guy in the first round," because that's not how it works. You can't. It turns out that the guy in the third round turned out to be pretty good, right? And that's great for him. But if he's never in the conversation as a first round pick, that's not a fair comparison.
Yeah.
But so I think that's part of it. It's right in their face. Who's doing well, who isn't. So you're going to adjust that. And I think, and also, let's face it, like, we are in the dawning of overanalysis, and everything is overanalyzed. And in the general sense, we're not subsistence farmers, so we have all this free time, relatively speaking, right, to this stuff. And you and I are making a living out of analyzing this stuff. And
Well,
so
when
there's
I'm
so
not
much.
building my own standing desk out of like a maple tree, and
Yeah, right,
farming my
right,
own food. Yeah. Anyway,
exactly,
exactly.
exactly. So I mean, in the general sense, everything is overanalyzed. Okay.
Yeah.
But then you get emotions involved, and football fans are emotional about their team, and they're not going to look for nuance. They're not looking for context, and they're just going to see what they see. And the other thing that's very difficult is, by the time a player, and many times, unless he explodes in year one, or is really bad in year one, something like that, the guys that picked that player are no longer with that franchise.
Yeah.
And when you're trying to do long-term studies of how well a team is doing in the draft, you have to consider new GMs, new coaches. Guy picked 2 years ago for one scheme is now playing in another scheme, and all these different things, and making a long-term evaluation process pretty difficult. So we lean on short-term evaluation, and that's what we got really looking for the bottom line. How's the guy doing? And another thing is over the expectation of players, and part of it is just because of the way that part of the draft process is you hope that a second, third, fourth round guy can really be better than what you expect. But a lot of people don't really know how rare true success is from second, third, fourth round picks in terms of like long term starters. I just took a quick look at some data before this, and like second and third round picks from the 2011 2012 drafts, they averaged like 20 starts in their career. I mean, it's not much. So making in the league is very difficult, and we want these guys to succeed, but it's very difficult to become above average NFL player.
Is there something? Are there some things when you talked about the difference between a first round and a third round guy? I mean, certainly we can talk about skill level and you know how good they are on or off the field in terms of like how their approach and everything like that. But is there something that you think should be added or taken away from what we would recognize as the differences between a higher round prospect and a mid to
Yeah.
low round prospect? Things that maybe are overemphasized, and you feel like that shouldn't be a reason why this guy's higher than another one?
Well, no, I don't know about that. I think most situations, everything. I, I don't know about that. The way I think about it is like the talent between a late first and an early third round pick is not significantly different in many cases. But what you're really talking about, the reason that they go later is the level of risk associated with them.
Right.
And whether it's work ethic, whether it's off field stuff, whether it's a position, running back, for example, the position attrition at the position, or demand for the position, or the supply of particular players. For example, this year the draft, we might have a bunch of wide receivers going between the mid and late, mid second round, late early third round. And it's not that they're significantly less talented that some guys that could go in the late first round. They just may have one thing in their game, and that's different. And also, there are so few guys that are so good that if you took all their categories and put them up, they're above average in every category.
Yeah.
Those are the guys that go in the top 25.
Yeah.
And the guys that go between 26 and 70 have varying levels of things that they need to improve on in their game. And the difference between, I just got asked in an interview a little bit ago, I was like, well, people were talking about this guy at 48, and now he's late first. I'm like, yeah, there's not very much difference between the 28th and 48th pick.
Yeah, it's a narrow margin of error for counting that we're saying all these players are in the 99th to 99.5 percentile of
Yeah,
football players. It's a narrow margin of stuff. Makes
yeah,
sense.
and but in terms of things that are um, overvalued, maybe, um, I think something that could be overvalued is a team's ability to coach him up. Um, there are some guys that, no matter how much you coach them up, they have limits,
Yeah.
and it's very. And look, these guys growing up aren't necessarily going. I mean, some guys go to amazing programs, they have amazing coaches, and they learn a lot and all that stuff. But some guys don't, and so there is some room for them to grow and to learn from coaching and things like that. But some of them are sort of maxed out in terms of their ability to learn and their athleticism, and it's not always clear, and that's why it's we don't have a perfect answer for who the best players are and who they're going to be. So I think one of those things, and the other thing is, a lot of people, NFL teams don't coach guys as much as they used to. Kyle Shanahan said that this year during a press conference, right?
Yeah.
He's got to work with his quarterback coach during the offseason to get better at some of this stuff, and we're just worried about game planning.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing on a week to week basis, and I don't know that people know that a lot. So
This audience does because I harp on it like
yeah,
I beat it to death with a hammer. But I'm
yeah,
glad you brought it up.
yeah.
No, well, that's cool. So what? I mean, why do you believe there's I think you probably somewhat answered this question already, but it's worthwhile just driving it home. Is why do you believe there's a greater emphasis on evaluation in the public eye?
Well, because like I think it's just it hits you in the face. Um,
Yeah.
Whether a guy was, there's no expectation of like there's no nuance in like this guy was a late first round pick versus an early first round pick, or a late second round pick versus an early second round pick. Hey, these guys were both in the second round. Our receiver isn't any good. Their receiver's really good. You guys messed up. And another thing is, and there's an assumption that those two receivers were meant to play the same role on offense, which of course is not the case. Rager and Jefferson were considered completely different players at some level, although a lot of people thought Jefferson would be a slot. I never understood that. I mean, he can play there. He had to play
Yeah.
there in LSU, but that wasn't what he was.
Right.
I wasn't limited to that.
Yeah, he was a multi-tool player. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but again, it's just much easier to look at the results and go back and have the hindsight to there, and then people roll that up into, oh, all these draft classes they've had, who's worked out, who hasn't, and they don't even necessarily look into see how other teams have performed. And there's no context of what is the average success for a team in this particular part of the draft or this particular position or things like that. And it's extremely difficult to do that because of some of the things I've already talked about. So
Yeah.
I think that's why, and that's one reason that I think draft grades are super important at the time of the draft. And people are like, you can't judge us till 3 years later. No, you can't use hindsight until 3 years later. You at the time of the draft, and when I do mine, I try to be very specific about this is about the player and their consensus value, and where they were picked based on that, and how teams use their draft capital, whether they looked at their needs, whether they took players despite of short-term needs because they know they need a long-term need, and looking at some of this nuance to it, and not just player X is a great player, therefore it's an A, in a draft grade. You're really, when you're doing the evaluation right after the draft, you're setting the baseline for which you can do evaluations of this class in the future. And if you don't have that baseline, all you're doing is hindsight.
That makes
That's all
sense.
you're doing.
Does.
So that's all. And so, like last year, for example, I gave the Lions a C after day one because they took Jamar Gibbs and Jack Campbell with their 2 first-round picks. Did I say a C because they're terrible players? No, obviously not. But going into the draft, they were not considered that high on consensus boards. Now, when you look back, they're gonna turn out to be really wonderful picks probably, and we'll see what happens with other selections that went around those guys. And we don't know after 1 year. Gibbs could get hurt. Campbell could be a solid player, but not really as
Grow
good as some of the
further.
guys behind him. We don't know. But you have to set that baseline right after the draft, so you get a true picture of what was thought at the time of the picks.
Makes sense. So where do you think, if at all, where draft media could do maybe a better job of emphasizing valuation?
Well, I think I kind of talked about some of the ways that I try to do that,
Yeah.
in terms of really looking at, was this guy, when you take a look at the whole draft board, was he picked in the general area that he should have been picked? And but the problem is, and we've kind of talked about that too,
Yeah.
every team is going to have a little bit different take on where the guy fits in their board, and
Yeah.
there is some significant differences on the board now. So that points to the thing. Okay, so are they bad at evaluation, or do they just have different factors? The things that
Yeah.
they are looking for in players slightly different. So it's not that they took. Maybe they shouldn't be looking for. Here's a great example: is Bill Belichick's no longer in the league. Well, not in the league for this year anyway. And the Patriots were always picking players well above consensus value, and they do not have a great track record with those picks. They just don't. And I've seen a lot of people say it doesn't matter where you pick a player as long as you pick a player you like. And I've seen enough data that show me that there is a statistically significant difference between players that are picked within a tier range of consensus value and outside that range, ahead of that range. And they don't perform as well. And so it does matter where you get guys. And I think, as part of the media, if we're clear about the expectation of a player picked in a certain round or a certain part of a round, and some of the context around why a team may have picked X receiver over Y receiver, if they needed more of a slot presence, if they already had 2 excellent outside receivers under contract for 3 years, and they want a guy that can provide more quickness and all those things. you could provide some of that context, and that might be what you do at the time of the draft, so that you know those things when you're looking 3 years later and trying to evaluate their evaluation. And because without that baseline knowledge, you're looking at hindsight without the full picture.
Well, I just will say on behalf of New England fans that we will not have slander of the New England Conservatory of Slot Receivers. You know, no, but no, that was a great explanation of that, and I think that it makes a lot of sense. So, let's round this conversation up with some of your favorites and some other notable players where maybe you have some concerns about their draft capital relative to what they have to learn. One of those players I just want to mention, I know is a little further down your list, but in terms of just what you mentioned, but I've told on this podcast that we've had conversations about Ben Sano, and you're
Yeah.
probably one of the first people I know. And I think I humorously mentioned to them, I said, I liked him. I said, but I mentioned to Chad just offhand. I was like, so what do you think of? I haven't seen many people. I don't care. Like I was like, where do you think? I don't care where they have him. This is where I like him because you had him as your second tight end off the board.
Yeah, and I ended up on this last 7 month round mock draft I did. I ended up putting him at the top of the third round, not because I think he could be Sam Laporta. I think he could be that good in terms of an instant impact guy. Just really good agility, and he gets off the line so well for a guy his size. You just don't see that often. And I think with this all around game, blocking, receiving, all the above, uh, I think he should be a top 50 pick, and hopefully he does end up in there. But you don't know with the tight end position sometimes how that goes. And other, like, there's a lot of wide receivers that could get picked in the top 50, and then maybe he drops out. But no matter where he goes, I think he's going to be a really good player. He's going to make an impact as a rookie. He's one of my favorites in the class.
What about that other guy in my old haunting grounds in Athens, Georgia? You got
That
him
Bowers
listed.
guy, yeah,
Yeah,
he's pretty good. He's
yeah.
pretty good too. And look, a lot of people were. It's funny, like we've just had this long discussion about valuation versus evaluation, and when I evaluate that player, there's no chance that I would put the valuation of him as a mid first round project as prospect. And I've seen a lot of people do that over the last couple months. I don't get it, but I'm not going to be surprised if he goes fifth to the Chargers, to Atlanta even at 8, wherever. I mean, it doesn't matter. He's high. He should be high on the draft boards. He's an excellent player. Again, likes or not, he's an all around guy, all around player. He didn't have to come back the way he did. He didn't have to have the tightrope surgery in terms of his NFL career. He wanted to come back, try to get Georgia as far into the playoff, getting in the playoff, whatever he wanted. And I think the toughness he showed doing that, in addition to his excellent body control, agility, does enough blocking to make him worth having on the field in 12 person. I mean, even in without 11. I mean, whatever you can play him. I just love him as a football player. I think it's sort of like a justice once said about pornography. I know it when I see it, and I when I see Brock Bowers, I know a great football player when I see it, and that's exactly what he is.
Yeah, I'm with you, and I mean it. It's almost like sometimes it's hard to judge speed on tape, but I'll say this: when it's obviously there, it's not hard to judge. Like
Yeah,
I mean, like
right.
when it's there at a high degree, it's not hard to judge, and for him, I don't think he's that hard to judge. But what about Byron Murphy? Tell me about him.
Uh, you know, uh, you're going to see him at fullback at some point. I can't wait to see that, or as a blocking fullback probably. But look, he's 6'1", 297. He's not a huge defensive tackle, but we've seen enough success. We've seen the Ed Olivers, we've seen the Elijah Canseys, we've seen. I'm not going to even bring up. He's not Aaron Donald. I mean, nobody is, but I mean, you can have guys that are small, but even though he's not 340 pounds, you might think he's playing at 320, 330 because he's a low center of gravity guy that can really hold line of scrimmage as well as very quick off the snap to penetrate and get to the quarterback. So if the giant, if the a lot of people were putting him again in the 20s. and I had enough of it in the last mock draft, and I put him at 11 to the Vikings and put Bo Nix down in the 23 as a potential quarterback. But he's going to go, and I think the highest he'll go is 9 to the Bears. So he could do a little bit of everything, and he's a fantastic player, and he's really got a great motor. I really like him. I think he's going to make an impact right away.
Sweet. A player that I think is, if you define safe as his his floor is essentially a guy who can contribute to the side of the ball that he plays on right away or early on, and his ceiling is Pro Bowl player if you can see a couple of things go his way in terms of
Yeah.
opportunity fit and additional development, even
Mm.
if the margin for that development is small. I would certainly put Blake Corum at Michigan on that list for myself as one of the safest players.
Yeah.
He's the safest running back in this class, if you ask me. Why do
Yeah.
you like him so much?
Well, I like pretty much everything about him. There's nothing about him that I would grade a 10 out of 10,
Right.
but I think everything is in the 7.5 to 8 area. And you got to love a guy. Look, he's 5'8", but I don't care about that because he does get lost. He got lost in that huge offensive line he played against in Michigan, and he knew where to go once he knew where he saw the cutback lane. He knew where the play was going, and his ability to find that spot to hit was very good. And look, the guy's 5'8", and he's a red zone monster. Like, he finds the smallest creases. He is smart enough to follow his guys into the end zone and not try to bounce things out. There's so much like him. And this year he played coming off a knee injury, and he wasn't as explosive as he was the year before, but that's very typical for a guy coming off a knee injury. And I think this year he could be even more explosive than he was last year.
Yeah.
And I think a receiver out of the backfield, I think he does everything, and that's what you want from a back. And I just, he may not have the fastest 40. I don't care about that because he will find a hole faster than some of the guys that ran faster 40s this year, and that he'll make up for 2/10 of a second very easily.
Yeah,
In that sense.
he has the compass that some of them need strapped to their back to tell them where the hole is. And
Yeah,
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 and I mean, when I think of guys in that 5'8", 5'9" range, 205, and if they have room to grow or don't have room to grow. If they don't have room to grow, you're looking at a Giovanni Bernard or a
right.
Brian Westbrook type of player, which
Ray
isn't
Rice.
bad at all. And
No,
then Ray Rice is that player on the high end who gained another 10 to 15 pounds and was still quick and became a Pro Bowl player. So yeah, I'm totally with you. I'm glad you mentioned Ray Rice because that's exactly where I see his potential ceiling if the physical part
right,
works out. And the
right.
other two, I mean, I would argue Giovanni Bernard got into the league 8 years too early,
Yeah,
because we might be looking at Austin Eckler as the
right,
precursor to Austin Eckler if he were in a different team in a different scenario. So
right.
so yeah,
But I mean, everybody wants a running back that can carry the ball 20 times a game. Everybody wants a running back
yeah.
that you can leave in a third down. Everybody wants a running back that will receive, and he'll be a good leader, and he'll work. And I haven't said anything that Blake Corum can't do.
Yep. But nobody wants to pay a running back. That's part of the problem too. But that's all right. Blake Corum's
Hey, they
awesome.
just paid a bunch of free agent money to running backs.
You're
So,
right. You're right. You're right.
yeah,
Yeah, that's true. And some good ones.
yeah.
Some very good ones. So that's a nice thing to see. So what about Cooper Beebe? Tell me about him.
I, you know, people will point to he's a big dude. He's going to play at 330 pounds, barrel chest, not the longest lineman. But all that cat did is you put him in at left. He starts the game at left guard. He'll switch to right guard. He'll play right tackle. He'll play left tackle. All he does is win nearly every rep. And he is smart, and he is strong and tough, and he will finish. And to me, that's what you want in a lineman. And he's one of these guys that'll be a second round pick, and people won't talk much about him. And then, he's on the Pro Bowl team as a rookie. Oh, well, I wonder how that happened. And I just, he's just a he's just a football player, and this is underrated. You have to have traits and all this stuff, but at some level, the guy's got to be really good at football, and he is one of those guys.
Yeah,
And you know, his athleticism testing wasn't bad. I mean,
yeah.
I think people expected him not to be a great athlete, but he's just fine as an athlete. He does not take a back seat to a lot of guys.
Processing information and technique along with
Yeah,
baseline level athletic ability you'd expect from a starter
that's right.
gives you a lot more than just a high end
That's right.
athlete with a lot of with tools, but not
Yeah,
a lot of skills to fully developed yet. Nice. Okay, so how about the last one here, Dadrian Taylor Demerson? Do I have that
yeah.
right?
I know.
Okay.
If you, Matt, if you were deep into evaluating safeties as much as you are about, I mean,
Yeah.
if that was your calling rather than the guys that you do,
Yeah.
you'd love this cat.
Oh wow.
Um, he's a 5'10" safety that tackles great in the open field. Whether he's in a two deep, single deep, whatever, he'll come up and play the run. He's like a slot receiver in a lot of ways. You know, not. I think Javon Bullard is probably a little bit above him. He's a similar player to Javon Bullard, but Bullard is just like that top 50 one, and DTD is the late second, third round guy. And he's one of these guys that broke my heart to put him at the top of the fourth round in my mock draft. I sincerely hope he goes higher than that. But as far as a guy, one of my favorite guys that's like a day three or a guy that maybe a lot of people don't know. Like, look, Texas Tech is not on anybody's not on very many people's list to watch on a typical Saturday.
Yeah.
But he just does everything, and he was so fantastic at the Shrine Bowl. He's just a guy I wanted to mention as really going to be one of these really, you know, Jermaine Whitehead, just these guys that end up being long time really good safety. Jordan Fuller. I mean, some of these guys that are just not huge names, but they play in the league forever, and his agility is great. I mean, his agility is great too. So you get a nickel, you put him at nickel, and he could be, you know, really really good player.
Nice. Good get. Okay, so who are some guys that, it's hard to say what we really think of them until we know where they land. So
Yeah.
who headlines that list for you?
So Oluf Fashanu is I want to say Fashanu, but it's Fashanu. Uh, Coming into the year, I really thought he could stake his claim as the top tackle on this draft, but he just wasn't very dominant. He's fine. He's got good length. He's got good athleticism. He's young. So there's some question marks about whether he can really dominate at the next level or just be a serviceable starter or a decent starter. Um, so he's a guy that I think there's just question marks about, and I hopefully he'll become the guy that we think he can become. But if a team uses a top 10 pick on him, it's a little bit of a risk, I think.
Okay. So what about Chop Robinson? I hear a lot about Chop as a potential explosive pass rusher and outside linebacker. I think so. So
Yeah,
what are your thoughts on Chop?
I think he could be that. And I'm not as worried. A lot of people just say only had 4 sacks this year, therefore he can't be any good in the NFL. I don't. That's kind of our metrics discussion again of like,
Yeah.
okay, that's true, and it's not. There's not like tons of examples of guys that have gone from limited production, relatively limited production, to great NFL success. So I don't blame people for pointing that out as a. But and so that's kind of where he's on this list of like we don't really know yet what he can become, and if somebody takes him, higher than 20 in the first round, and with if they have a first round grade on him and all that, then there could be some risk involved in that because he may prove to be that. No, the one thing that is underrated when talking about him and talking about edge rushers is he primarily played on the left side of the on the defensive line. So he's and most quarterbacks are right-handed, so he's in their vision. Okay, and they can unload the ball, they can step up. If he swaps places with Adisa Isaac on the other side and plays more blind side, he may have some more sacks. So it's going to be interesting to see if like Will McDonald came out last year and sort of similar kind of prospect that bendy edge rusher, and he went in the middle of the first round and didn't do much this year. And maybe he steps up in the future, but sort of that similar guy. So if he goes where Will McDonald went, there's some risk involved there. But if he goes late first round, early second round, it makes sense.
Well, we've talked about this next guy for like months, I think. So,
Yeah,
so this is
years.
your chance to talk some sense into me about Michael Penix, since Michael's on your list here.
Well, and again, it doesn't really have much to do with his game.
Yeah,
And it's just going to be, where do teams take the risk of
yeah,
his look? You know, if he had a one-time injury issue, that's one thing, and if it was just one injury that happened 3 years ago, we'd be talking about him as one of the top 3 or 4 picks in this draft, probably. Um, but when you end 4 seasons early with shoulder and knee issues, that's a lot. That's a lot to consider when you're using a high first round pick on him. And he played with the brace all year, even though he didn't have an injury the year before. Still played with the brace all year. He wasn't the same guy after Michigan got in his face a little bit in the national title game. But it's not that he's a good athlete and all that. So I'm not like, it's just a guy that you really have to be concerned or careful about how high of a pick you use on him. And if you protect him, if you allow him to use that arm, he's got a quick enough delivery, he can get rid of the ball. There's a lot of things he can do, and if you give him a good situation, he should succeed. So it's just a matter of risk and how high you want to take him, and so that's my
yeah.
concern with him as an overall prospect.
So, just out of curiosity, I have this like just kind of casual working theory that when you look at the backup that a team selects that needs a quarterback, you can kind of see the template of the player that they may be
Mm,
heading towards. Like to me, I see Sam Darnold and I think Drake May is going to Minnesota.
yeah,
I
yeah,
see I see Zach Wilson getting traded if it went through, Zach Wilson getting traded to Denver, and see JJ
Denver.
McCarthy.
Yeah,
But I see
or Bo Nix, or Bo
or
Nix.
Bo Nix, and I would love that, to be honest, because I like Bo a
Yeah,
little bit more. But I see both as fine. Then, but I also look at this and I think to myself, boy, it would be nice to see. But then it's kind of funny because do we see Gardner Minshew and we say Michael Penix, or do we,
yeah.
as a
Or do we
possibility?
say Aiden O'Connell is like Michael Penix?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. I mean,
Right.
that's a lot. That's a lot more like it. And so, it wouldn't be shocked if Gardner. Look, we know what Gardner Minshew is.
Yeah.
We know what he is. We don't really know what Aiden O'Connell is yet, and we don't really know what Michael Penix is yet. So to me, that's the more apt comparison. Gardner Minshew is a guy you bring in to sell headbands, and no,
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. He's a guy that you know can win games with. At some point during a season, you can win a game with them or game two. So that's the more apt thing. And I try to think about the same. I've always thought about the same kind of thing when I'm looking
Yeah.
at who might take who,
Yeah. So,
who might take
like
whom.
whom? Yeah.
Yeah,
But so, what about the Giants and Michael Penix? If you've got Locke, you've got Jones. Jones has one more year. Locke's kind of a sling it guy, without who has maybe had to learn a little bit more discipline as a decision maker. Um, could that be a possibility in like round two? For
I don't.
him?
I don't think the Giants would take him.
Yeah.
Um, with a guy Jones has been injured.
They're
I
a
think
conservative group.
yeah, I think honestly the Giants are going to look either to trade up to 4, um, or maybe stay put and see if one of these guys falls to them.
Yeah.
But I think they're more in the Drake May, JJ McCarthy category, to me,
Yeah.
for if that's who they'll be most like. I like the
Yeah.
Raiders with Penix. I do. Or maybe the surprise team in the second round with him.
Yeah.
It could be interesting.
Yeah, I think he's going to be a second round player if you ask me,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
that will be interesting, and I'm also kind of starting the countdown if the Vikings draft Drake May, that that when Justin Jefferson will be demanding a trade within how many
Yeah, right.
years,
Yeah,
at
right.
the end, but at the end of that contract. But with that said, how about another receiver? You got a receiver on here that is kind of polarizing in the draft community, it seems like. Former Georgia Texas guy, A.D. Mitchell.
Yeah, I think he's one of these guys that a lot of people are projecting as a first round pick. That I think will be more like a George Pickens guy that gets kind of more in the middle of the second round because the inconsistency. Just watching him at the combine when he was trying to run different routes, you never knew where he was going to be exactly. Quarterbacks couldn't really say he's really going to be at 7 yards on that out, and you just weren't sure what you're going to get on a play-to-play basis. And I think, uh, in terms of a guy that can take the top off and make a play downfield, he can do that. So, like you hope he can become more. But I think he's just a guy that, again, it's a more of a matter of risk. How much growth does he have, and what is his ability to really learn the craft?
Yeah. So who's your final guy?
Uh, okay, Kingsley Sua Matia, and
Okay.
so that wasn't terrible.
No, not
Sua
bad at all.
Matia from BYU, offensive lineman. A lot of people look at his combine workout and say, "Oh, he ran a nice 40, oh, whatever." And then you watch him in drills, and you saw the issue with his footwork that showed up on tape. And I think, in theory, he should be a big BYU tackle. Maybe Andy Reid will love his BYU guys so much he'll want him in the first round. I don't know. But to me, I think he's a guy with some risk in terms of his ability to stay with better edge rushers on the edge. Recovery speed once he's leaning outside, being able to cut back inside. I think at the Senior Bowl, actually, Jim Nagy may have announced him as a guard, maybe if I remember that right. So I think he's got some limitations in terms of movement skills that don't necessarily show up in the 40 and some other tests. So I think he's a guy that will probably be better as a late second, early third round pick. And if teams take him earlier than that, then it's a little bit of a risk to me.
That makes sense. So listen, you're probably the easiest person to say where can people find you, considering that what's going on in your window over here. But in addition to NFL.com, is there anything that you specifically would like to highlight or underscore for people to continue to check out of the work that you do?
Well, people can see my stuff on NFL.com. I don't really care about that. I just hope people buy the RSP. Buy it, people. If you're watching this and you haven't bought it, buy it because it's awesome.
Well, I
And
appreciate that.
no, I just uh, you can check me out on Twitter, I guess. Chad_Reuter, Reuter. I haven't been posting a lot there lately. May do a little bit more this year, but and NFL.com's got my stuff, and
Yeah.
it's thrilled. I'm thrilled when people read it. And, I got an email. I got a tweet today from a guy in Brazil whose name was Igor Reuter, spelled the same way as mine, and
Wow.
says, "My American cousin, nice job on the mock draft." So that was nice. That was nice, and that's the beauty of Twitter.
Yeah.
I won't call it the other thing ever, but and just being able to see that and getting, I've this is the 15th year I've shared the same email chain with a guy from Denmark named Soren. 15 years I've been talking to this guy about the draft from Denmark. I mean, it's just amazing things like that
Yeah.
allow that kind of social media stuff to do. So
That is amazing. I mean, it's fun to I do podcasts in Australia and in the
right,
UK, and I've got folks in Germany and in Denmark who've talked about it, and I have a wide receiver obsessed person in South America who sends me their own evaluations, which I'm going to get around to. I know it's been late, but he uses the RSP's process to evaluate wide receivers.
nice,
So that's
nice,
pretty cool, when you
yeah,
got crazies like that. So yeah, for all of you out there who just love the draft, obviously you should know Chad and know his work, and he's been doing fantastic work for a long time, and that's just to say that we're both old, and
that's right.
and so we appreciate you guys listening out there in the way that you have, And again, you can go to mattwaldman.com for the RSP. And it was a great conversation as usual. I'm glad we got to spend a little time to do it. And you guys take care out there.